Welcome back to Trosclair's take on the World Wars, and in this video today we begin with the Interwar era. And so in the past several videos we've explored the beginnings of the First World War, the course of the war, and its immediate conclusion, and now in this new set of videos we get into the interwar era, the 1920s and 1930s. And so here is sort of the outline of this section here, these 20 years. We'll begin this video with the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. We'll wrap up officially the First World War, but we're also going to start planting the seeds of future conflicts. In the next video, I'll get into sort of the general trends and developments, what's just generally happening in the 1920s and 30s of importance, and then in later videos, we'll get into the Soviet Union, the rise of fascism. I'll then get into Germany and its path from democracy to dictatorship by 1933 and the rise of Hitler and Nazis, and then we'll end with the road to World War II. And so my last video, we ended the war in 1918 on November 11th at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. We finally had armistice. Germany now has agreed to an armistice, has agreed to end the fighting. I mentioned in the last video, I believe I said Germany surrendered in a real car. No, technically that's actually where they signed the armistice. And so I'm going to come back to this issue because the Germans didn't believe they truly lost the war in the end. They didn't see this as really surrendering. They just saw this as an end of fighting. And well, we'll get to sort of the outcome for Germany with the Paris Peace Conference in a bit. But remember kind of where we are, especially in Germany right now. There are revolutions breaking out. There are communist revolutionaries on the home front in Germany. Again, there's still people starving. There's still a lot of supply issues. The Kaiser has abdicated. A republic has been declared. And so it's a really chaotic time in Germany, but also a chaotic time in Europe generally. And so as we get into the Paris Peace Conference, keep in mind ultimately that there are a lot of things going on here. Just because now we're going to talk peace doesn't mean the fighting really stopped. You still have the Russian Civil War, for example. I mentioned other communist revolutions in Hungary, for example. With the breakdown of empires, you're going to have all these national groups try to fight for territory so they can go to the Paris Peace Conference and try to get a recognition for their various claims. And so there's still a lot going on. The guys at the Paris Peace Conference are going to have to deal not just with the past 4 years, but also deal with the present situation. And so let's turn to it. 1919, the year will be dominated by the Paris Peace Conference. You'll have all sorts of people arrive in Paris in January to deal with the fallout of the First World War. And if you remember, about 100 years ago in 1815, we had the Congress of Vienna. And so a lot of these guys are going to Paris thinking, oh yeah, we're going to, have a bunch of parties, hang out, and we'll work out some peace deal, just like they did at the end of the Napoleonic Wars back in 1815. But again, this conference is going to be, as they're going to discover pretty quickly, a very different experience. Again, they need to respond to moving parts, basically, moving things that are happening on the ground. They're going to have to respond to what's happening back in their own home countries and public opinion now, which the diplomats at Vienna didn't have to deal with 100 years ago. But you're going to have all sorts of people show up, delegates from all different countries, especially, of course, the Allies. You'll have representatives from Australia, from Japan. You'll have the Big Four. You'll have the US, France, Britain, and Italy represented. And really, despite all these other people being at the conference, it's these countries that will ultimately make the final decisions about what happens now with Germany and the Central Powers. And I want to note, by the way, that the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, they're not invited to this conference to negotiate and actually talk things out. No, the Paris Peace Conference is going to come up with a plan that they're going to present to the Central Powers that the Central Powers need to accept. And so this is going to cause some tensions later, but we really have a lot of the allies. But let's get into our big players here. And again, there's really only two that I want you to know by name because they represent sort of the two big forces or ideas at this peace conference. The major figure in the Paris Peace Conference is U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. So remember, 1916, Woodrow Wilson's been reelected. He promised to keep the U.S. out the war, but eventually by 1917, the U.S. will declare war after Germany persists in unrestricted submarine warfare. And so Wilson now becomes a huge celebrity. He arrives in Paris to a hero's welcome. So notice the sign there, Vive Wilson, long live Wilson, as he rides through the streets of Paris with the French President Raymond Poincaré. And while Wilson is an idealist, he is showing up at this conference not looking for specific compensation for the United States. He really sees this as an opportunity, the Paris Peace Conference, to make a better world. Again, we've gone through this awful world war. The world's torn itself to pieces. Like, let's actually do something here that has real lasting effects for the good. And so remember, he wanted, as he said, to make the world safe for democracy. He wants to promote democracy around the world. And he wants this to be the quote-unquote war to end all wars. Let's try to create a system here, and we'll get to his idea in a second, of making this the last real war. And let's really put together a good peace settlement here. And again, we want peace without victory. Again, we want a peace without really winners and losers. We want everyone in the end, again, he's an idealist, to really embrace peace and to create a peaceful scenario where there's no sort of, hurt feelings, basically. Back in January, remember our war ends in November, back in January, in a speech to Congress, he's going to announce his 14 points. And so Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, they're basically the things he wants to see after the war. He's kind of laying out with the 14 points here the agenda for a future peace conference. And really what he's putting out here is, hey, Germany, if you're gonna, if you want to surrender, here's sort of like my terms. Again, if you want to surrender, you need to agree to these things. And so the 14 points, he's laying out basically here his post-war agenda. And so I'm not going to ask you about like which are each of the 4 points, but let's look at what he here is really trying to promote. And so those first 5 points there, again, open diplomacy. So remember why this war began, a lot of those secret defensive alliances. And what happens is when the Bolsheviks take over Russia, they basically unleash and publicize all the old secret defense alliances and treaties that Russia had signed. And so now everybody sees, wait, the Russians were, who's promising who what? And so all of a sudden it becomes public just how intricate the alliance system was pre-World War I. And so notice first thing he wants is open diplomacy. Again, let's be honest about what we want in the public realm. Let's not try to just do like behind closed doors meetings and try to make backroom deals. Let's be open with our diplomatic relations with others. Let's have freedom of the seas. Again, that's why the U.S. got involved in the war. Again, we should have the ability, neutral powers, neutral countries to ship wherever. So again, freedom of the seas. We should remove economic barriers, meaning tariffs. And so again, very liberal mindset. We should have open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and the removal of tariffs, basically, so that people can engage in trade. The idea being, and we'll see this later, after World War II, and the idea being that if people trade with one another and they economically benefit from trading with one another, they're not going to want to go to war with one another. And so let's try to increase trade around the world. Let's, of course, reduce armaments. Again, militarism, the arms race, German naval expansion, those were big issues that helped lead to this world war. Let's try to work on reducing weapons around the world. He has a sort of vague adjustment of colonial claims, and so maybe like give freedom to people in colonies. It's kind of unclear. But notice the next 6 through 13. Conquer territories in Russia, Belgian sovereignty, restoration of French territory. What do you think that may mean? Redrawing of Italian frontiers, division of Austria-Hungary, redrawing Balkan boundaries, limitations on Turkey, the establishment of an independent Poland. What all these really boil down to is the principle of national self-determination. And I would define it as a nation can determine how it wants to be governed, or a nation should determine how it wants to be governed. In other words, what we're basically having here now is the influence of nationalism by 1919. And that, again, now that we have the breakdown of the old empires, all these various nations should theoretically have their own states. And so with national self-determination, what he's basically arguing here is for the creation of nation states. And we'll get back to this later and how, again, this is as I've stressed before, nationalism works in theory and practice, it's complicated. And so, but he's coming with this idea that, again, we should promote the building of nation states, and each nation should determine how it wants to be governed. Monarchy, republic, its borders. Again, that's going to be a sticky issue, though. Lastly, the creation of an association of nations. And well, point 14, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. In other words, what we need is an international peacekeeping organization. And that's really kind of what we're getting at. And well, post-World War II, we have a international organization promoting peace called the United Nations. But the predecessor of the United Nations is now what's going to be coming out of the Paris Peace Conference. What Wilson ultimately proposes, more specifically, the name of it, is the League of Nations. We need an organization of countries to work out problems. Again, we don't want to end up with a world war. Again, we had that Balkan conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary evolve into the First World War. Again, we want to have an organization that can look out for those issues, solve those issues, but especially look out for countries. We need a League of Nations to try to deal with the world's political issues so we don't end up in another world war. Now, again, he's very idealistic. This is, again, the UN, the League of Nations, is an idealistic organization. Again, we're trying to achieve world peace. Not impossible, but, again, it's going to have its challenges. And so notice the cartoons there at the bottom. The one on the left, he's literally handing this League of Nations branch to the dove. I don't know the text there, but the dove's basically like, do you think I can really handle this? Do you think League of Nations is really going to bring peace? Notice he's blowing bubbles, the bubbles of idealism, and blowing this League of Nations. And so, again, he comes in with these high-minded ideas to try to make the world a better place. And so Germany, here's your way out, he basically says. If Germany, you want to make peace, you need to agree that you're going to, agree to these points here. The other players, we have the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, looking out for the British Empire. We have the Italian Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando. When Italy doesn't get what it wanted from this conference, he's just going to go home, and he's going to actually lose and be voted out of power. And so, not going to really focus on him. But the other person I think you should know by name is the person representing France, and that is Georges Clemenceau. Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France. Clemenceau, he's been around, a politician, he's been around for a long time. His nickname was the Tiger, and that kind of gives you a sense of what he's like. Again, he has his reputation of being this really sort of aggressive, tough guy, and so notice in the bottom left there, I found the other day a cartoon of him as the tiger going after German eagle. He's been especially a hawk about fighting the Germans, keeping up the war against the Germans. And so at the bottom there, notice the photograph, he's there in the trenches with French soldiers. By 1918, a lot of French soldiers were starting to mutiny. Again, we've been fighting and jumping out the trenches and charging the German lines and being machine gunned down, again, taking massive casualties. French soldiers were just starting to really give up and mutiny against their commanders and start to really challenge the government. And well, Clemenceau goes down to the trenches to show them. He spends good time there too, and he puts himself in harm's way to show the French soldiers, like, look, the government's not detached. I'm with you. We're with you. We need to keep up the fight, and we're going to win. And so Clemenceau has been aggressive about promoting the war and continuing the war against the German invaders. Clemenceau is a realist. And this is why I think Clemenceau is a good character here. He represents the realist wing. Wilson's the idealist. There we go. Wilson's the idealist. Clemenceau is the realist. When he heard of Wilson's 14 points, he supposedly said, the good Lord had only 10. This guy's got 14 commandments. God had only 10. So again, this high-mindedness of Wilson, he's very skeptical. And he's not willing to play nice with the Germans. Notice on the right there, at the peace table, Clemenceau's the waiter, inviting the German delegates to sit down. If you notice the chairs, they got little tacks there to poke the butts of the German delegates. And so he says, take your seats, gentlemen. So again, he's not really willing to play nice. But think about the French perspective. Of course we, the French, are not going to be wanting to play nice. Again, those Germans invaded us. We want punishment for Germany. And for Clemenceau, he also wants security for France. And so this is, for me, I think, a little slogan to kind of remember what Clemenceau was really about. We want punishment for Germany and security for France. Again, Germany has a larger population. The French birth rate is down. This is the second time in Clemenceau's life that the Germans have invaded France. Again, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Now in 1914, he does not want to play nice with the Germans. He wants to punish them, make sure the Germans cannot be a threat to France again. Again, this is not the peace without victors that Woodrow Wilson wants. So notice the cartoon there on the right I'll come back to in the end. Clemenceau there is holding the string of the guillotine. And notice Woodrow Wilson on the left with his hands out like, come on, no, please don't do this. And the guy who's being brought to the guillotine is representing Germany. The guy to the right there is the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who tended to side more with Clemenceau. And so, again, these two individuals representing these two different views. For France, they've lost a lot of soldiers. And again, I told you I'd come back to this chart here. And so notice the French casualties, again, 1,300,000 killed. Notice the U.S. killed 126,000. 126,000. So with that, again, for the French, yeah, we want payback. We don't want all this blood to have been spilled for nothing. We don't want all this destruction in northern France, which looks like a hellscape or a moonscape, to be for nothing. And speaking of the French population, I'm going to point this out too. Again, statistics don't tell the human side of the story, but I think this sort of chart helps explain in a way, or helps show just how devastating this war was on populations in Europe. Let's look at the one for France here. So here's our population pyramid. What I want you to see first is notice at the top, this represents the amount of old people. On the left, you have the older men, grandpas. And on the right, you have the older females, grandmas. Middle-aged population, and then the new babies are all the way at the bottom. And so again, the horizontalness shows you how many people of each sex are in the population depending on their birth year. And so older at top, younger at bottom. All right. So notice here, number one, it says at the top, that's a decrease in births because of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Now watch what happens after the First World War. Whoa. So here is a population graph for January of 1934. And so two things I want to kind of highlight. Notice here, number 4, the shortfall of births. And so because so many young men are on the front lines, they're not back at home making babies, and well, there's the drop essentially in population, which bounces back after a little bit of a baby boom. But also notice here where 1 in 3 is, or sorry, where 3 is technically according to the chart. So that is the military losses from the First World War. And so notice how on the female side, you have what's a typical kind of curve, but you have a significant portion of several generations basically wiped out as a result of this war. And that doesn't, and I'm also want to kind of point out here, again, and there's even more guys that are either emotionally or physically damaged that are part of these generations. So we're going to come back to this in the next video. But again, for France, we don't want to play nice after this war. So let's turn to the compromises that these two sides will ultimately make. Again, neither side's going to completely get its way. Wilson's idealism is going to have to relent in a certain sense, but as a result of these compromises, we're also going to have some problems. And so these two cartoons here featuring Wilson's showing up to the concert to conduct World Peace Symphony. All those different countries there have their instruments, and at the bottom it says, can he produce the harmony? Can he ultimately achieve his idealism? On the right, you have Wilson with his 14 points before the European baby show, and well, he's going to have to deal with all of these claims that the English want, the French want, the Polish people want. And again, it's not going to be easy with all these crying babies. And so with that, our compromises beget our problems. First thing I want to highlight here is that there are actually 5 different treaties that come out of this conference. So again, it's a conference, a lot of people get together, but what the Allied powers will do is produce 5 different treaties for the Central Powers, all named after some neighborhood or palace in the area of Paris. And we'll get to the Treaty of Versailles later. That really is the big one we need to look at specifically. But with that, there are 5 different treaties, and what they're all going to do is ultimately promote, again, one of the big things Wilson wanted and others wanted, which was national self-determination. We're going to break up those empires and create new nation states with the peoples on the ground. And well, you've had a lot of national groups wanting their own independent nation state or autonomy for a long time in the 19th century. And now let's do it. But again, it's not going to work out perfectly. And so, all right, national self-determination. So think of Italy, for example. Again, Italian nationalists said, let's have Italy join the war against Austria-Hungary because we have those areas, or they have those areas in Austria-Hungary where there are majority Italians. And because they're Italian speakers, they're part of the Italian nation. And if they're part of the Italian nation, they should be part of Italy. And so Italy joined the war because the Allies promised them these areas here in black, part of the Adriatic coast, what is today Croatia. And well, ultimately, the Allies say, yeah, we're not going to give you all that in the end. Ooh. Yeah, the Allies make a lot of promises, and they don't really keep them all, which is going to annoy a lot of people, and annoys Italy in a big way. So Italy's going to get the Tyrol here, part of it. They're going to get some parts of the coast, but they're not going to get everything they were promised. And for the Italians, we'll get back to this with the rise of Mussolini and the fascists in Italy later. For the Italians, it's like, look, we sacrificed a lot of soldiers for this war, and you're not giving us everything we were promised, so Italy's going to be furious. One of the things Italy won't get is what a city here on the Adriatic coast called Fiume in Italian, or the Croatians call it Rijeka. Italy was promised this to get into the war, and after the war, the Allies decide, we're going to give it to somebody else. And an Italian nationalist, and the picture on the right here, an Italian nationalist is actually going to lead Italian troops on his own, kind of go rogue, and take this city briefly. So this becomes a major sticking point for Italy and this new country we're creating. And while as a result of national self-determination, One of the new countries on our map is based on a country we've actually had before. And so we have the creation now of a new kingdom called Yugoslavia, which technically breaks down into the land of the Southern Slavs or South Slavs, Yugoslavia, South Slav land, basically, which is built on the old kingdom of Serbia. And so the Serbian nationalists basically get what they wanted back in 1914. This is basically fulfilling the dream of Gavrilo Princip and the Black Hand. The Serbians now get all the Serbians in Bosnia, and they're also going to be having and dominating a kingdom of other Slavic group. The idea was we want to unite all these Slavic groups of the Balkans into one state. So you got Croatians, you got Slovenians, you got Montenegrins, Macedonians. Yeah, we should try to create a state of Southern Slavs here. Well, we're now have technically what's called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. King Alexander of Serbia will arrive in Sarajevo, same building that Franz Ferdinand and Sophie left before they were shot, the City Hall of Sarajevo. Serbia now, the Serbian king, are going to dominate and control Yugoslavia. And, well, we'll get back to this later because, well, yeah, there are people who want all the Yugoslavs, the South Slavs, to be united, but they're Croatian nationalists, they're Slovenian nationalists, they don't want to really be part of this. So we'll get back to the problems with this later. Again, this is going to come back to be a big issue in the 1990s. But for now, we have a Yugoslavia, Southern Slavs. We're going to have a Poland again. So again, one of Wilson's 14 points specifically, we have here Poland being created from the former Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires. The Poles are going to have to fight for their own country. Again, even though the Paris Peace Conference is saying we're allowing you to have a Polish nation state, it's invaded, and Warsaw, the capital, is almost conquered by the Soviets during what's called the Polish-Soviet War, because the communists of Russia, or Bolsheviks basically, were trying to expand the communist revolution into Europe. And, well, Poland will be there to prevent that and prevent the collapse of their newish nation state. The other big country we'll have too on the map, we'll get back to later, is Czechoslovakia. We have a Czech-dominated state. Again, the Czechs and the Austro-Hungarian Empire for a long time were upset because, hey, the Hungarians got autonomy, but we in Bohemia, we didn't. And so Thomas Masaryk there will be at the Paris Peace Conference, will be promoting an independent Czech state. And, well, what we're going to do at the Paris Peace Conference is add the Czechs with the Slovaks to create a rather large Czechoslovakian state. Again, this goes back to the other issue of security. Again, France especially wants to make sure that it has these allies in the East to counter Germany. Again, we can't really trust Russia anymore. It's communist. So ultimately, we're going to put the Czechs and Slovaks together. But if you notice, Czechoslovakia too, again, it's not just a purely Czech state. You also have this region here. And it's a region we're going to get back to in a very big way on the road to World War II. And so, according to national self-determination, nations should be able to determine how they want to be governed. And, well, here you have an area that becomes known in this era as the Sudetenland. So the Sudetenland was an area of Germans in this new state of Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland was a German majority area of Czechoslovakia. And so for German nationalists here, the Germans here were like, hey, we want to join either the Germans down south in Austria or we want to join Germany proper. We don't want to go from being the majority in Bohemia under Austria-Hungary, the old days, to being a minority underneath the Czechs, who basically the Germans treated like trash. And, well, the Germans say, look, we want the Sudetenland, this area, to be part of not Czechoslovakia. And the allies of the Paris Peace Conference say, no. Ultimately, what the allies decide is that these areas of Sudetenland, they're mountainous for defense, which is good, and they're kind of industrial. And, well, if we want to keep a good, solid, powerful eastern state to counter Germany, be a counterweight against Germany, we don't want to give these areas to Germany ultimately. We want these areas to stay with Czechoslovakia so it can use the natural boundaries of defense, the barriers of defense, the mountains in this region here, and also the industry there. And so Sudetenland crisis, we'll get back to this later. Again, national self-determination, in some ways it's being promoted, in other ways it's being compromised because security, it becomes an issue. Let's briefly look at the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary real quick, because we'll come back to this a little bit later. The treaty dealing with Hungary, Trianon, named after the palace near Versailles it was signed at, is going to take apart Hungary. Again, Hungarian nationalists have wanted for a long time, and they've had the old historic boundaries of the Kingdom of Hungary. But as I mentioned before, in the revolution's 1848, again, not everybody in the Kingdom of Hungary is Hungarian. You got Slovaks, Croatians, Romanians, etc. And, well, what the Paris Peace Conference will do is basically take away 2/3 of the Kingdom of Hungary's land. They'll take away, I think, like 20 out of 28 million people out of Hungary. And so the Hungarian nationalists will be furious with this. No, this is our borders. Who cares about the Romanians want, right? Notice too here, there's an area here still today with a very large Hungarian population. Now it's going to be part of a Romanian nation state. Because, well, again, Romania was on the winning side of the war. They joined the war to get these areas Romanians from Hungary, and they're going to get it. And so Hungary's cut down the size, and this is still an issue today. If you go to Hungary, and you go to drive around Budapest, you're going to see the old boundaries, like these stickers here, of the historic Kingdom of Hungary. There are Hungarian nationalists today who want to have, quote unquote, sort of true Hungary. There's a memorial there, notice in the bottom left. Trianon's like a guillotine. It's killing our nation. Notice the protesters there at the bottom with the sign showing like this, this is what's like if you had France and you took away areas from France. So this is for them what they kind of feel like, these Hungarian nationalists. So notice the cartoon on the right, the Hungarian cartoon with the Hungarian being chained down as others take away his territory. The top you have their place today in Hungary called Liberty Square. There's now a Soviet war memorial for the Soviets who liberated Hungary and Budapest from Nazi Germany. But before then, you had here memorial to Trianon and the crime of Trianon. So it's kind of a word that brings up a lot of different feelings in Hungary still today. Hey, what about national self-determination for peoples around the world who are dominated by European powers? No. Ho Chi Minh, who you'll get back to later in some way with the Vietnam War in the U.S., he was a young man who happened to be at the Paris Peace Conference. He showed up to try to push for Vietnamese independence, and he did not really get a welcome reception. But again, you have now colonial or colonized peoples, indigenous populations wanting independence from the European powers. The Zionist movement will be told by the British, oh yeah, when this war's over, we'll do something about a Jewish nation state. Just help us out in the war. Oh hey Arabs, oh you want an Arab state? Well, help us out and we'll work this out after the war. And well, ultimately, neither of these promises will really truly be kept. Germany's colonies will be basically divided between the British and the French, though they're not technically to be called colonies. They're to be called mandates because technically here in Iraq and Jordan, the British will be sort of governing these areas, not really controlling or annexing them. Syria and Lebanon, the French will have control over. And they also will split Germany's colonies in Africa and take Germany's colonies in Asia will be given to New Zealand and Australia. But with that, national self-determination is not going to be there for other peoples. And well, as a result of the compromises and the decisions of the Paris Peace Conference, we have the creation of the League of Nations. Based in Switzerland and Geneva, a lot of countries will join. A lot of countries will join later. By 1939, a lot of countries will leave for various reasons, League of Nations, but it's around. But there's one big country that's not part of it. And it's the country that, through Wilson, promoted the creation of the League of Nations. The United States is ultimately not going to be a member of the League of Nations. And so this cartoon here shows the gap in the bridge. Belgium, France, England, Italy. It's designed by the President of the United States, but the keystone to make this work is the USA, and well, the US is not going to be part of it. Ultimately, League of Nations is not going to be the most effective organization in history, as we'll see later, because the great powers, especially now the US, is not really going to be there sort of providing it with the real will to maintain world peace. And so, the U.S. emerges briefly as a world power, but now after the war is going to go back to not being isolationist, but just not really wanting to deal with other people's issues. And so Wilson's going to have a really hard time trying to get the U.S. Senate to agree to this. So again, according to the U.S. political system, the Senate agrees to treaties, and so the U.S. is technically not going to agree to these treaties because of the League of Nations. You'll have here, for example, Republicans in the Senate opposed to the League of Nations. There's Wilson leaving the little boat there. I like this cartoon here. It looks like the Kool-Aid Man commercial. You have the U.S. here about to marry foreign entanglements. And here is the League of Nations, the peace proceedings. Does anybody object to this marriage? And here comes the U.S. Senate busting out through the window to stop this. And so a lot of Americans said, especially senators said, wait, we don't want the U.S. to be part of this League of Nations. Again, we got involved in the First World War, but we don't want to be dragged into another European or somebody else's conflict. Again, do we really want, our young men from Ohio to go fight other people's wars? No, and that was kind of the idea. And well, ultimately, the U.S. is not going to join the League of Nations. And so notice Wilson here pulling the U.S. into the Temple of Peace, the child who wanted to play by himself, and Wilson at the bottom basically saying, look, I promise you be the life of the party. Come on, kid, let's go into the League of Nations. But ultimately, the U.S. doesn't want to get itself involved in foreign wars again, and it's going to kind of retreat from the world stage. And so lastly, let's turn to the big treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. And so we have our 5 different treaties dealing with all the central powers, but the one that will be the most important, especially as we kind of look forward to the Second World War, is the Treaty of Versailles, specifically dealing with Germany. Notice the date it was signed, June 28th, 1919. What happened 5 years ago on this day? The assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the event that eventually sparked the First World War. It's been 5 years since that day, and now by 1919, that's a long forgotten event. Again, so much has happened since then, but on June 28th, our treaty here is signed. And here in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, our great French palace built by Louis XIV back in the 1690s, early 1700s. And so what does Germany have to do? Because remember, the Allies are putting this together and telling the Germans, here's your deal, take it. The first big thing Germany's going to have to do is disarmament. So remember, before 1914, I showed you this chart previous videos ago. Germany had 4.5 million soldiers and a standing army reserves ready to go. They eventually put 11 million soldiers in the field. But now after the war, because of sort of the history of Prussian militarism and everything, again, we need to look out for especially French security. What we're going to do is disarm Germany. Germany can now have an army only of 100,000 men. That is a glorified police force. Notice the cartoon here. The German state there, no reserves, 100,000 soldiers. And notice France. France is going to keep a very large army, and it's going to make alliances with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Belgium. And so notice this German cartoon here pointing out basically how Germany now is going to be sort of subject to France and its allies. But again, France is trying to look out for its security. It wants to punish Germany. Only 100,000 soldiers. And by the way, no planes, tanks, or subs. All those new modern offensive weapons, can't have them. No air force, no tank force, no submarine force. The Germans can't have an air force. But notice at the bottom there, what Germany's actually going to do is secretly have a fighter pilot school in Soviet Russia in the late 20s, early 30s. And so the German army is going to be secretly training military pilots in Russia because they're technically not allowed to do this in Germany with the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans won't be allowed to have a large navy either. Remember, for the British, this was a big issue, the German naval expansion. And what's going to actually happen is right before the treaty signed, the German fleet will scuttle their ships. They'll sink their own ships, so they won't end up in the hands of the British, the French, etc. So with that, again, the Germans can't have a navy. Along with this, the Germans are going to have to demilitarize the Rhineland. In other words, nothing military in the Rhineland. Again, the Rhineland there, that area bordering France. Again, France here and Germany share the Rhine River for a bit. And then the Rhine River goes up through Western Germany, major river in German history. Again, there could be no soldiers, basically, to the west of the Rhine River. And the Allies will actually have troops. We'll have American troops there, actually, for a while, occupying Western Germany. But with that, again, the idea here, ultimately, is that, we don't want, for France, especially, we don't want Germans launching another surprise attack through Western Germany again. If they have to start their invasion from the eastern side of the Rhine, that gives us some time to prepare. And actually what the French really wanted to actually control all of this directly and annex this basically to France. But the Allies said, no, we're not going to go that far. Rhineland just needs to be demilitarized, Germany. Germany's going to lose territory. So I mentioned a little while ago, Germany will lose its colonies. They're also going to lose some other areas. Most notably, if we're thinking about France here, they're going to have to give back now Alsace-Lorraine to France. And so again, those areas that caused a lot of tension between France and Germany when Prussia/Germany took them in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, Alsace-Lorraine now returns to France. So France gets its revenge in the end. The Germans will also give up a piece of territory, which we'll call the Polish corridor. So we create an independent Poland, but we want Poland to have access to the sea. And so what they will do, the Allies, is basically force Germany to give up this territory here. There's a city called Danzig, not getting the complications of it, but ultimately Poland will get access to the sea. There are also a lot of Poles who are living in this part of Prussia. They're still Polish speaking. Notice the language map at the bottom, but notice what this does. This now separates a part of Germany from the rest of Germany. It separates Eastern Prussia from the rest of Germany and gives Poland this access to the sea, which is not going to go over well in the long run. We'll get back both to the Rhineland and the Polish corridor on the road to World War II. What about uniting with Austria? Again, Austria, the core of Austria was inhabited by Germans. The Germans of Austria said, hey, what about national self-determination? Can't we join now our Germans in Germany and create Großdeutschland, big Germany, like was proposed back in 1848? The Allies say no. Again, the Allies, especially France, don't want Germany to have more people, more resources, more territory that can make them more powerful. So no, Austria cannot be united with Germany. We'll get back to this later on. And now here's the big thing, the War Guilt Clause. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles becomes later known as the War Guilt Clause. And here's what it says. The Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts, the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. Germany, in other words, takes responsibility for the war. Why did this war break out? Whose fault is it? And Germany has to accept it's really Germany's responsibility. This is not going to go over well. Notice the cartoon at the bottom. The crime of the ages. Who did it? Who killed the peace of Europe? And there's sort of like God's hand looking for a culprit, and everybody's kind of pointing at different people, and there's Germany in the middle. And this is a hotly debated question then. It's still a debated question today. Who ultimately, which country, was most responsible for the First World War? And so usually what I do in Western Civ classes at this point is on a quiz, I've had students answer this question. So which one of the following countries do you think was most responsible for the outbreak of the war in Europe? Which country is most responsible for this becoming the awful war it became? And so I present the options here. I'm not going to read France. I added France last year, but I just was throwing it in for fun. But really the big four. Serbia, because the Serbian government encouraged anti-Austrian Serbian nationalism and didn't do enough to control radical Serbian nationalist groups in Serbia like the Black Hand. Russia, because the Russian government had been meddling in the Balkans, especially by encouraging and backing Serbia. It turned a Balkan crisis into a European war when it began fully mobilizing the Russian army. Germany, because if the Kaiser hadn't given Austria a blank check, then the Austrian government wouldn't have declared war in Serbia. Germany turned a Balkan crisis into a European war by implementing the Schlieffen Plan. Austria-Hungary, because the Austrian government insisted on using the assassination as an excuse to finally crush Serbia in a war, knowing it could turn into a European war, and despite Serbia accepting most Austrian demands. And so a couple years ago, this was the result I got in 2016-2017. 42% blamed Austria-Hungary, followed by Germany and Russia were tied. Lastly, Serbia. Last year, 50%, half of students, voted for Austria. Germany, Serbia, and Russia. I found it interesting how those had shifted. A lot of historians blame Austria-Hungary. A lot of historians also point out that Serbia and Russia had a hand to play in this war becoming as devastating as it was. But in 1918, 1919, and still today, a lot of historians blame Germany. And actually, in 1919, Germany was seen as the culprit. Even a few years later, people began to realize maybe like everybody had a hand to play in the beginning of this war. Again, historians today kind of say multiple countries had a hand in this war. It's still a controversial topic to an extent. But ultimately, in 1919, the Allies will say Germany's to blame because of that blank check. And so with that, the reason ultimately the Allies want to blame the war on Germany is because they want the Germans to pay reparations. They want the Germans to pay the Allies a bunch of money for the damage Germans caused. How much? That's actually something that will be determined later. It's not something actually established in 1919, but they're like, oh, we'll settle this later. Germany's got to pay billions of dollars in damage. And guess when they finish paying off that reparations money they owed? 2010, 10 years ago, a decade ago. In 2010, Germany officially finally paid off their First World War debts. For various reasons, of course. There'll be the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, but ultimately, again, it wasn't until 2010 that Germany paid their reparations payments. They finished that from World War I. And well, as I've already hinted at, and I've already said to some extent, the Germans are furious with this treaty. This treaty is, according to a lot of Germans, an absolute national humiliation. Again, remember, the Germans ultimately thought they'd be like negotiating with the Allies. No, the Allies said, here you go. Here's our terms. Here's the Treaty of Versailles. Sign it or else. And the else here, and this is what students often don't catch, is that if the Germans don't sign this treaty, the Allies are going to invade Germany. And they had plans to just invade Germany. And well, if you're the German government, do you sign this humiliating treaty, this awful treaty? Or do you let the Allies just invade your country? Because the German army can't stop them now. And so notice the cartoon on the top right, the Allies, the Big Four, basically force-feeding Germany these peace terms. And so the Germans are furious with this. They called it the dictated peace. Again, we were supposed to, we thought, like, sign an armistice, we were going to negotiate, and then you're just dictating this peace to us, and it's an awful deal ultimately. And so notice the sign at the bottom there, they're the protesters. Again, people go out to the streets, there are rallies against the Treaty of Versailles. The sign there says in German, "Nieder mit dem Gewaltfrieden," never with the forced peace or dictated peace. Again, back to the cartoon at the bottom left of Germany, is a German cartoon. It's sort of like, it feels like for Germans, Germany's going to the guillotine ultimately. And now this gets to a major issue, which is that there's a myth or a legend now that develops pretty quickly that Germany was stabbed in the back. Again, why do we Germans have to submit to this humiliating, awful peace deal? Well, the German people were not told the truth about what was happening with the German army in the Western Front. The German army on the Western Front was falling apart. It was defeated. But propaganda back on the home front said the German army is doing fine. And so a lot of people thought, like, wait a second, why do we have to submit this humiliating treaty? Well, it's not because the German army lost, but because Germany was stabbed in the back. The Dolchstoß, the backstab. By whom? Who ultimately agreed to the armistice. And for the Germans who stabbed Germany in the back, who stabbed the nation in the back and betrayed it, it was the Republicans and the Social Democrats. Germany was stabbed in the back by Republicans and the Social Democrats. Again, remember, it was Philipp Scheidemann there who, in November 1918, after the Kaiser abdicated, announced the creation of a republic. He was a member of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. You had others in this SPD who were the largest party now forming this new Republican government. You also have Matthias Erzberger there, the leader of the Catholic Center Party. He not only signed the armistice, but in November of 1918, but he also was one of the people who signed the Treaty of Versailles in June of 1919. Philipp Scheidemann, the SPD guy there above him, he actually resigned from the government because he thought the Treaty of Versailles was so awful. And so ultimately, a lot of, we'll get to the term right-wing later, a lot of right-wing conservative Germans blamed the quote-unquote November criminals for this awful treaty. And so notice on the right there, you have Germans in the trenches fighting fine, and there is Philipp Scheidemann of the SPD and Matthias Erzberger there of the Catholic Center Party, again, stabbing Germany in the back. And it says they're in German. Germans, think about it. And you probably also notice the other big thing here. And notice the Star of David on this hand, and notice back here, stereotypes of Jewish businessmen, Jewish financiers. And so Germany's stabbed in the back by the Republicans of the new Republic Germany's forming, stabbed in the back by Social Democrats, the socialists, and, well, as we'll get to by 1939, the Jews will also be blamed for stabbing Germany in the back. Even though thousands of Jews actually fought in Germany's army for the fatherland, Jews will also be blamed by other sections of society for stabbing Germany back. So for the Germans, this is a awful peace, but they have to sign it in the end because the alternative invasion is worse. And so notice this cartoon here, peace and future cannon fodder. And there is Clemenceau and the British Prime Minister, the Italian Prime Minister Wilson here walking. And the tiger, Clemenceau, says, "Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping." And there's a child weeping, and notice what it says above its head, the class of 1940. And so there's a lot of people who see now the Treaty of Versailles as not perfect and laying the seeds for a future world war. The supreme Allied commander of the Allies and a major general in France, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, said afterwards, "This is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. And while 1919, 1939, he ended up being right. In the end, this is going to maintain peace for about 20 years, but by 1939, Europe is going to be back involved in another war. And I don't want to make it sound like war is inevitable. I am emphasizing how this treaty is going to help lead to the Second World War, but there are going to be a lot of other developments and choices people make and governments make between now and then in these 20 years.